Good morning. Welcome, everybody, to our first in a series of talks about something that I think almost everybody loves, chocolate. This is Professor Nick Wesemann, and I'm Professor Steve Giambrone. We're going to talk a little bit about something that we all love a lot and hopefully learn a little bit along the way. This is the first iteration of a three-part series. So come back next week, next Friday at the same time, same place. And we're going to have a panel of 4 different people. One person zooming in, fingers crossed, from Costa Rica, who works on a farm growing chocolate, growing cacao. We'll also have some people from Christopher Elbow Chocolates talking to you, from Encore Coffee and Chocolate, and also from Melted KC. So we're going to have hopefully 4 different perspectives to discuss all things chocolate. And then the third iteration, you want to talk about that one?
Yeah, so the third iteration, we're going to do a tasting. So I'm going to put together several chocolates for everyone to come in and taste. We're going to taste them, talk about them, talk about what makes them different, how they're made and stuff. So that'll be a very tongue-on sensory kind of thing to come to. There are limited seats on that, so if that's one you want to come to, there's a link sign up floating around somewhere. I think it's up on Info Hub and things like that. So if you'd like a slot on that, please sign up because I want to make sure you have enough chocolate for everyone.
The spots are going fast. No joke. I think there's only, what, 6 still available?
I think so. We had it at 30, but still
no pressure, but just
even if you're still welcome to come by, even if you don't sign up, we'll probably have a little bit extra too. So everyone's welcome to join, and we won't have chocolate for 1,000 people. So because chocolate's getting expensive. So
indeed. So just to kind of preempt, why we're doing this. And oh, by the way, happy Valentine's Day, everybody. Yeah, I mean, chocolate goes with Valentine's Day, but Nick and I are co-hosting a cohort of students for a travel study abroad or study away travel course to Costa Rica. And the focus is coffee and cacao production and sustainability of those agricultural products.
Can staff go too?
We wanted to.
Can staff go too?
Can staff go too? It's open to anybody. You have to enroll in the course. It's a 2-credit-hour course, but it's available for anyone if you enroll in the course. So absolutely. And we're going to talk more about that. We're going to put information about that up. You can see a couple posters, one over there and one over here by Taylor Swift. There's a QR code, so you can zap that with your phone, and it'll take you to our college online portal for the International Ed Office to learn more about the trip and register if you want. So, okay. So, this is going to be an informal talk, so you guys will get to ask your questions. You can ask questions along the way. I'm fine with that. We'll also have a Q&A, period at the end. There's going to be some demonstration. Nick's going to demonstrate some of the processing of cacao with you guys, and you'll get to see that, smell some of it as well, even have some tactile experiential learning that goes along with it. Okay. So, all right. So I'm going to kind of get us started by talking about some of the botanical history and botanical information about this product. So you guys are looking at this image. You know what these are, right? Well, actually, not the beans, not the cacao beans, but the pods. Yeah. So the beans, or botanically seeds, are inside. So we'll. Oh, I pushed the wrong button. Hang on. Maybe it's oh, we haven't turned it on. First step is turn it on. Thank you. Thanks, Nick. There we go. So yeah, so chocolate is a processed food that comes from a plant, and part of the plant, and the plant is the cacao plant. So cacao, the scientific name is Theobroma cacao, and it belongs to a family of plants that also shared with cotton, hibiscus, food crops like okra and durian. Everybody seen a durian fruit? It's that really crazy spiky shaped fruit.
super stinky.
It's kind of has a very unique smell. Not everybody likes it. It has kind of a sweet, stinky smell. But yeah, all part of the mallow family. Carl Linnaeus, back in the 1600s, the father of modern biological taxonomy, actually gave the name, at least the genus name, to the plant. And of course, Giambrone means food of the gods. Species name comes from the Aztec word in the Aztec language that means bitter water. And it certainly is bitter. A lot of the sweetness of chocolate, of course, comes from sugar and milk and other additives you add to it. So I'm going to show you some images of the actual flowers and then the seed pods. But what's interesting is that unlike a lot of the flowering plants in temperate areas, where we live, doesn't exhibit this type of quality, but it's more common in tropical areas. This concept of cauliflory, which is where the flower is actually born right out of the woody stem. In fact, you'll see it coming right out of the trunk of the trees. I've got some images showing you that. Pollination is done by these dipteran or two-winged flies that are midges, real tiny little flies. Both the males and females actually visit the flowers for nectar for the food, as food for the flies. And in doing so, the flowers are pollinated. And there's about 20 to 60 seeds usually inside the pods. And as you're going to see, the seeds are surrounded by this white pulp. The pulp is edible. In fact, I'll talk briefly here in a minute, it's probably the pulp that was the first, crop or agricultural use by humans, because it's slightly sweet. It can be fermented. If anybody has been to Oaxaca, Mexico, there is a drink or beverage of sorts. It's kind of a frothy beverage. You can see the woman preparing it with all this frothiness. It's fermented. It's slightly alcoholic. Tejate, I think is how it's pronounced. Tejate is a Oaxacan beverage that is produced from the fermented pulp of the cacao pod. The seeds have about 50% fat content. So Nick's going to talk a lot about cocoa butter. And that's, the source of the cocoa butter. And its caffeine content is debatable. If there's caffeine, it's going to be low amounts, but theobromine is a compound that is similar to caffeine. It does have stimulatory effects in human physiology. But that's the number one, probably the main chemical compound in chocolate that perhaps makes us feel good when we eat chocolate. So this is an herbarium diagram drawing of the cacao seed pods growing on the branch there. You can see, just kind of get us some perspective of that. But the photographic images. So there's the flower. You can see a little bit in the background how it grows right out of the woody stem, which is kind of unusual for, perhaps for us to see. Plants around where we live don't do that. Has everybody ever been to the rainforest to see this firsthand? I remember the first time for me, it was in the Belizean rainforest, and we were hiking, and it was this really remote hike. And my friend, we looked over, and it almost looked just like this. It was amazing. This is not my photo, but I have a similar photo. This is better by far. But you can see the flower and the seed pod growing right out. When we talk about, the chocolate industry and the plant, there certainly is a lot of genetic diversity. But in terms of how we define the genetic diversity as it is for coffee production, there's really three main varieties of cacao that's used to make chocolate. And as you're going to see in a minute, the vast majority of the chocolate you're consuming is coming from the Forastero variety, and it's 80 to 90% of the commercial chocolate is from that variety of cacao. And most of that today is grown in Western Africa, and we're going to talk about regions here in a minute and why that's important. The Criollo version, which probably is still growing in Latin America, only about 5 to 10% of the chocolate is produced from this. The difference in flavors, this is kind of the higher end, more sought after, more expensive type of chocolate. This variety is more robust. It's more disease resistant, easier to grow, higher productivity, but the flavor profile maybe isn't as subtle and delicate as you might find here. And then the Trinitario variety is actually a hybrid that developed naturally, probably naturally, then was cultivated, a hybrid between the two. And this is grown in different parts. It's certainly the #1 grown in the Caribbean and also grows in Latin America. So 10 to 15%, it's estimated, of the chocolate is produced.
Can they be grown in can they be transplanted up here and could be used in a greenhouse?
Can the cacao plant be grown here in regions like, temperate regions in a greenhouse? Certainly. It's just really difficult in terms of, especially if you're going to grow it for production. It's just not a sustainable way of doing it. Your costs, the scale at which you need to do that. I don't know of anybody, and there's a lot I don't know, but I have never heard of anybody trying to do that. But could you grow a cacao plant in a greenhouse up here? Sure. Are you going to get cacao pods? Maybe after a few years, if you're lucky. How many seeds you're going to get out of that? Probably not many. So, it's a matter of scale and, in the rainforest, where these plants originated, you're going to have the production heat. That's not a cacao plant or a fruit. But I want to talk a little bit about fruit. I'm a botanist, or, I teach botany, and everybody knows the peach, right? So I'm going to use this to kind of introduce some of the fruit or floral parts of the plant to make it have more sense. So when I teach this to my botany students, we talk about the different fruit parts, and it's easy to apply here because with peach, the fuzzy, skin is referred to as the exocarp. Carp meaning the container that's going to contain the seed eventually. So the exocarp outside part. Mesocarp is the delicious juicy part that we love when we eat peaches. The hard stone in the middle is actually not the seed. That's the endocarp, or the inside covering of the seed. You'd have to crack that open to access the seed inside. So to apply this terminology to the cacao pod, this would be the exocarp out here, that orange part. The kind of yellowish part would be the mesocarp. And then that little perimeter, really, really thin, is the endocarp. Inside all of that are the seeds, but then the seeds are surrounded by this kind of fleshy, juicy, slightly sweet, fairly carbohydrate rich, sugar rich pulp. And then of course, when you pull all that out, you've got the seeds. So you can kind of see in this diagram, exocarp, mesocarp, endocarp, and then you've got the pulpy seeds inside. When I talk to my botany students, all seeds have a seed coat. Here's some of that pulpy flesh that's still sticking to the seeds. Once that's removed, you've got this little striated seed coat. Nick's going to talk about that. That's removed in the winnowing process that happens after roasting, usually. But then once that is removed, you've got this. You refer to this as cacao nibs once it's broken up into pieces. So that's really the seed inside. And it's the seed that we use to, after it's roasted, to grind up and then combine it in ways that Nick is going to talk about to make chocolate. So a little bit of some of the botanical history. Where did coffee originate? The research is pretty clear that cacao originated, evolved in the Americas. And most of the research tells us that it probably evolved in the Amazon. Probably eastern Ecuador, the eastern slopes of the Andes as it, slopes down into the Amazon basin is probably where the plant originated in evolution. And we know that this was also then brought to Mesoamerica and then domesticated there. The research is a little bit equivocal as to could it have been started to be domesticated in Amazon and then also brought up to Mesoamerica and grown there for, as a crop. And I think that's still kind of debated. The Criollo variety we know is, endemic to the Latin America, Central America, and Northern South America. This article talks about how the Mayas cultivated this over 1,500 years ago. And this suggests that perhaps this variety actually did originate in Central America. So there's still some debate. Did it evolve only in the Amazon basin? Some of it in certain varieties evolved in other places. It's still kind of a subject of debate. In terms of human use, thousands of years ago, the Olmecs of Mexico were probably the first to ferment, roast, grind the cacao beans for drinks. So we know that humans probably started using this for the pulp to, as a food product for the sugars that are in the pulp. But then, eventually started to use the seeds, the ground up seeds for drinks, and consume it as with other ingredients as a drink. Nick's going to talk a little bit more about that. And we know this because the archaeologists, when they dig up and get artifacts from their digs, and they find the vessels, the pots that were uncovered, there is evidence of the chemical theobromine. And theobromine can be found in other crop plants that are related to this, but it's most likely that it was derived from the cacao plant. So we know that, during that period of time, humans were using that as a source of food and consuming it. Shifting over a little bit to today, economics. The crop originated in the Americas, right? Central America, or probably the Amazon of Northern South America. But today, when you buy your chocolate or consume chocolate products, it's coming from Africa. It's coming from West Africa. And these statistics date back to 2019. But even today, I don't think the numbers have changed much. The top two countries are Ivory Coast and Ghana. There are some other countries, but in terms of, nation by nation, those are probably the top two worldwide chocolate or cacao exporters, and also where it's grown. So, we've shifted parts of the globe where, it's being grown for production. Part of that, if you're asking why, part of that is, well, one important part is because while cacao was grown in the Americas, fungal infection devastated a lot of the crops during the production. And it was probably, even in Costa Rica, there was a thriving cacao production in that country until about the 1970s. And the infiltration of this fungal pathogen got so great that a lot of the farmers along the Caribbean coast in Costa Rica gave up their cacao production and switched to banana. Now, as you'll see in a short video I'm going to show you later, that's starting to come back because of adopted more sustainable farming practices, indigenous-led initiatives for sustainable farming practices are trying to bring that back, and that crop production in that country is coming back. But what's one of the reasons it shifted is for this reason. In these countries in West Africa, it's that Forastero variety, the more hardy variety that is being grown there and then shipped out everywhere. In the bottom, I know this is kind of hard to see if you're in the back, but exporting here, top exporters, top importers of cacao for chocolate products. So Netherlands, Germany, US, as of 2019, we were the third biggest company spending money importing cacao. So it gives us an idea of
Did you
perspective.
speak to the Belgium being exporters?
Yeah, that's interesting. And and by the way, all this website called Visual Capitalist is I've used it as a source of economic data. It seems to be robust. I rely on it. And I think from what I've dug into, they're importing and then exporting. So, we're not growing cacao in Belgium, but they're importing and then exporting. So, as an exporter, regardless if it's grown there, they're on the board. And of course, they're exporting to other European countries and even.
Because they're importing more than they're exporting. So it's like, okay, what's going on?
Yeah. So they're importing a lot, but they're exporting a lot as well.
So Steve, are the Belgians taking the raw cacao and then processing it in Belgium and legend of Belgian chocolatiers that's going on?
Sure, so the countries that are importing the cacao beans, the fermented, or if you wanna call it raw, cacao, yeah, they're gonna import that, they're gonna do most of the roasting. Nick's gonna talk about this when he talks about processing. They're gonna roast it in the country of importation, once it's in the country. And then process it in all the products they're gonna do. But getting to this point, some countries import raw cacao and then they export it as well. We're taking students to Costa Rica because it's close and relatively cheap and safe and all the reasons and beautiful. So some statistics about Costa Rica. When I taught the last cohort of students, I gave them this statistic: 48th largest world exporter of cacao. But I just like a week ago found a statistic from 2023. It came up. So they do have a burgeoning, economy in cacao production. It's starting to ramp back up slowly but surely, and in actually more sustainable ways, which is nice to see. Oh gosh, wall of words. I think I'm gonna skip that because of time, but let me just kind of cut to the chase. So sustainability issues related to this agricultural product. I always like to talk to students when we talk about this, is that, if you're growing a product for human consumption that humans like to have, there are, threats that affect the cacao production itself, threats to the plant and growing the plant, harvesting of the product. So we know that because of climate change and because of agricultural practices themselves, there is an increase in plant disease and pests. That seems to be burgeoning and getting, increasing. There's also the problem of loss of genetic diversity in the crop production. And this also goes back to the farming practices and how the farming of the crop plant is done. And it isn't just with cacao. If you study this with almost any other crop plant, it's the same idea. And genetic diversity, the diversity in the genomes of the plants that are growing is important because it's that diversity that makes them resilient. And if we lose that, then we lose that resiliency. In terms of threats from, to the greater environment from cacao production, there's with any production of plant products, you've got potential loss of habitat because of how you farm it. There are more sustainable ways of farming. But then what I'm going to focus on, and we're going to focus on with you guys today, is the issues with human equity and social justice. And it's Valentine's Day. We're talking about chocolate, so it's all good stuff. But I always tell students, so I'll tell you guys because you're my students now, we have to look at the whole picture. And there is potentially kind of a dark side to chocolate. So I'll show you a video that has to do with that. And that is this video. If I can play it, do I click? What button do I click? Is it this button? Can you just do it from there?
The first time in his young life, gets his first taste of chocolate. He's been working on his family's cocoa farm for 7 years. His father says he put his son to work to prepare for life's challenges.
I don't have any money to pay laborers, and because there are no schools nearby to accommodate all the children, they help with the farm work.
Children as young as 4 are brought to farms to become conditioned to such an environment as they grow. But new rules are being introduced in Europe that aim to enforce stricter protection of human and children's rights, as well as the environment. And producers in countries like Ghana believe they could be affected.
Activists say more than half of all children living in agricultural areas are engaged in work, most of them dangerous work.
Activist Emmanuel Lani knows what it's like to work as a child farmman. He grew up on a cocoa farm, but later graduated from university. His case is considered exceptional.
I would have just dropped out as my colleague have always been doing. Most of my friends' ladies go pregnant along the line.
Across West Africa, 1.5 million children are involved in cocoa farming. Many work as farm laborers and earn less than $1 or nothing at all. For Publishers in India travel to rural communities to buy cocoa beans for $60 a sack. But they sell at 2 or 3 times that on the international market.
As a cocoa farmer, how much will you earn after harvesting your cocoa? The price is even lower, as much as 800 Ghana cedis. So all the time you see our friends are closer to us. There is no quality education for them.
I would say attempts by Western cocoa buyers to force down prices is keeping hundreds of thousands of children out of school and condemning them to a life of poverty. And they argue only by them receiving better prices and education being improved can the lives of children like improve too. Ahmed Idris, Al Jazeera, AM Clinic.
So there is this issue of where our cacao and the cacao that goes into our chocolate products is coming from, and it is mostly coming from West Africa, Ghana, Cote d'Ivoire, and most of it's being farmed by kids out in the fields. And there is an issue with this idea of social equity or social justice, because a lot of times the kids aren't able to go to school. They're working in dangerous conditions. They're not paid very much. So this is one of those issues that we're dealing with. The big chocolate companies, Nestle, Hershey's, Cargill, which is the middleman for a lot of the chocolate that comes into the US. These are all US companies. They're aware of it. They've all made pledges to address these issues, which is great, right? That's what we want our companies to say, because they're the producers of most of the chocolate that's consumed in the US and other countries. But these issues are still happening. It hasn't been fixed. It's still going on. And there's even a case of an international lawsuit against some of those big US companies by some of the workers. There are laws that allow non-nationals to sue US companies if those companies are involved in business practices that then cause harm to those workers. So these issues are still pending, and this is kind of a dark side of our chocolate. So we don't want to end on a down note, right? So what's the good news? Well, the good news is, we can be choosy where we buy our chocolate from. And there are places where chocolate is produced more sustainably. So let me take you to Costa Rica now, and to the Caribbean, or near the Caribbean coast of Costa Rica. To the indigenous group called the Bribri.
Business
Let's see if we can skip this time.
Design tailored, just
No, okay, we gotta let it play.
for you. Customize every element of your website.
The Bribri people live along the Caribbean coast in Costa Rica, and it's a matriarchal society. So the women are the leaders. And as you're gonna see, as soon as we get through all this stuff, they are bringing back some sustainable farming practices.
Could you repeat the name of the community?
Yeah, the indigenous group is called the Bribri, B-R-I-B-R-I. So the Bribri are the indigenous group. Well, listen, this is.
El 80% de las personas que producen cacao en Salamanca son mujeres, ¿verdad? Y es una cultura con una particularidad bastante interesante, es decir, una cultura con una lógica matrilineal. La tierra es posesión de las mujeres y son las mujeres las que pasan la cultura y el idioma bribri en estas comunidades.
El cacao para nosotros los bribris es importante tanto para la parte espiritual como ceremonias, bebidas, también también se obtiene recursos económicos. En las fincas integrales, uno de los beneficios o los beneficios que se obtienen en las fincas integrales, principalmente en las fincas como la mía, que es más que buscar recursos económicos, se busca la seguridad alimentaria en mi finca. Por ejemplo, en mi finca puedes encontrar desde tubérculos hasta animales.
Beneficios ecosistémicos que ofrece la biodiversidad, que tal vez son difíciles de cuantificar,
pero que están ahí, ¿verdad? Como la diversidad de flora y de fauna, ¿verdad? De especies nativas que interaccionan en estos sistemas agroforestales, servicios ecosistémicos como el control de plagas y enfermedades dentro de la diversidad, permiten una autorregulación de las plagas y de las enfermedades que a veces es difícil cuantificar, pero ahí está ese servicio. Entonces, realmente la diversidad tiene muchos servicios comerciales y no comerciales que la familia se beneficia de estos sistemas agroforestales.
Es una manera de subsistencia, sí.
And for the sake of our time base here, so we get out on time, I'm gonna go ahead and skip over to our next slide, but just so you guys know, there is, you know, as consumers, we do have choices. And it's possible to source more sustainable chocolate. So this is what we're gonna be teaching students in the course. We're gonna go into more detail about that. But for the rest of our talk, Nick's gonna talk a little bit more about getting to the processing, you know, how do we turn cacao beans into the things that we love to consume?
Hi, so this first slide here, this is an image of Montezuma, and they're holding here in this glass, like a frothy glass of chocolate. This was initially with chocolate. Going to a brief history of cacao, it's been around for a long time, like more than 4,000 years. Initially, the cacao beans were used as money, but eventually they would serve it as a bitter drink, and that bitter drink was that frothy drink that you saw in the previous slide. Here's also an example of it. Here's an image of a person with a cacao bean, but that drink was believed to make rulers virile and was like this godly drink, but it was very bitter. We didn't really start adding sugar into the process till the Europeans came over and brought both cacao and sugar back into Europe. So, and the first chocolate bar was created in the late 1800s. So when you think about the history of chocolate, like chocolate, as all of us know it, is actually really, it's a relatively new product. Here's a longer history of cacao, but if we look here, like first commercial bar, like 1847. So, you know, less than 200 years that like chocolate's been around, kind of the way we use it when we start eating it as like a sweet confectionery. So it's still kind of in its youth as kind of how we know it. You've seen these more images here. But when you talk about the process to actually get the beans into chocolate, they're first fermented, and that coating, that white coating on here, that's usually left on it to ferment. Those sugars break down, and during the fermentation process is where you start to get complexity of flavors to develop, and all that happens. They're then dried and then roasted, and there's some like dried and roasted beans down here. I also have, let me see. You want to pass these around. These are some cacao beans. These aren't roasted, but these are fermented and dried. If you smell in that container, if your press is around order, it's kind of sour because it still has that like lactic acid and everything from fermentation. So those are actually cacao beans. Feel free to grab one. We'll break it down here in a minute. But during the fermentation, the flesh breaks down. You get protein and carbs breaking down, and you get the flavor changes. So you get some flavor change there. But then there's the drying. They're typically dried on these big open mats in the sun. They're raked. But whenever you dry anything, you remove water, you remove acid, you concentrate the flavor. So this is when you start seeing more of the chocolate flavor develop. It intensifies that cocoa flavor.
Wait, so are these dried?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Got it.
No, I mean, if they weren't dried, like they would spoil. So they have to be dried and fermented like that to make it over here. When they're roasted low and slow, and that's what really gives us like those dark, intense cocoa notes that we're used to. With the Maillard reaction happening, which is amino acid reaction with proteins that gives us kind of like those caramely flavors that we associate with like meats and bread and coffee and chocolate. Sometimes it's confused for caramelization, but it's not that at all. And then winnowing is where the shells are removed to separate the nib. So you can see here, it's been crushed. This is the nib on the inside, and this is the shell. So if you grab one of those beans, if you crush it, if you want to, it will fall apart and you'll see the outer skin come across and you'll have the nib on the inside. And if you crack that open, like you can eat that nib stuff on the inside, that is essentially what chocolate is made out of. It'll get a little messy, but it's gonna be better. But those are the nibs there. From the nibs is where we actually start on the process of making the chocolate. So initially these nibs, they're ground down and liquefied. So traditionally this may have been done like with two rocks, like mashing rock on rock to kind of break it down. Anymore we use like steel mill rollers like this, where the chocolate is like passed through two steel rollers and eventually ground down. And like as he mentioned, the nib is about 50% cocoa butter. So as you apply heat to that, as you apply pressure to that, the cocoa butter is kind of forced out of the bean, out of the nib, and you go from like dry nibs into kind of getting this liquidy, pasty substance once you pull the fat out of it. In commercial production, typically that mixture is then pressed and separated out. So you end up with cocoa powder, like the cakey brown chocolate stuff, and you end up with cocoa butter, which is, it looks like kind of white chocolate. It's yellow. When you melt it, it looks kind of like melted butter in its solid form. Got some here. I mean, it looks like just yellow, kind of hard. This is pure cocoa butter for a demo. It's then reblended in specific ratios, which I'll talk about. This is when you would add sugar and other, like if you're doing milk chocolate, things like that, you would add flavorings. And then it's then conched. And conching is also a relatively new process. Its process takes anywhere from like 2 to 4 or more, 2 to like multiple days. But it's shaping the particles of the chocolate to where they're so small and they're pearl shaped and they're so small that our tongue can't feel them. Without this process, chocolate is very gritty, it's very grainy. So it's making these chocolate particles indistinguishable on the human tongue. So I kind of give you a visual on this, kind of how it goes. So we start with our nibs up here, they're roasted. We then grind them down into chocolate liqueur. So that is just chocolatey paste, no sugar at this point, it's just crushed up nibs. It's then pressed to separate out the butter and the solids. So with the cocoa butter, we can then add sugar and vanilla and we get white chocolate. So people are always asking if white chocolate is actually chocolate. I mean, it's made from the same plant we get dark chocolate from. So there's no reason for me not to consider it chocolate, even though it is a very different flavor profile. But we also use cocoa butter in a lot of other uses. What do we see cocoa butter popping up in?
Lotion.
Lotion, skincare products, sometimes like just sold for like people like me to use cocoa butter in recipes and things like that. But during the reblending, this is where you'll take cocoa butter and your solids and you add your sugar and you reblend that to specific ratios. And that's going to kind of determine the intensity of your chocolate. So if you're making milk chocolate, you would add milk solids, sugar, vanilla, things like that, conch it, you get milk chocolate. If we just had like sugar and a little bit of vanilla, then we get dark chocolate to it. So talk about that. Different types of chocolate level. And that percentage that we saw in the previous slide, like if you ever go and buy quality chocolate, has anyone seen like the percentage on it? You'll see like 55, 75, 85%. That's telling you the percentage of, typically the percentage of cocoa mass in that chocolate. So if we're talking dark chocolate, that's kind of letting you know what percentage of those cocoa solids are in it. So a higher percentage chocolate is going to be more intense, more bitter, more robust. A lower percentage is going to be a little bit more sweet because you make up that difference with sugar, maybe milk powder if it's milk chocolate. If we're talking about white chocolate, typically the percentage on a white chocolate is how much of it is cocoa butter. And white chocolate tends to be around 30% cocoa butter and the rest of that is milk powder and sugar. So very high in sugar. But yeah. In the US, for it to be called chocolate, it has to have at least 10% cocoa solids. So if you're 9%, you can't call it chocolate. You have to call it like chocolate confectionery product or chocolate flavored confectionery. But this is kind of the bare minimum. And a lot of your like Lower end candies like Hershey's, Nestle's, things like that. I mean, they're right at they're at like 10%, 11%, just skating by to get as little as they can and still call it chocolate. Higher quality dark chocolates tend to run for dark chocolate anywhere from like the 50 to 70 or higher range. But unsweetened chocolate, this is might be you've seen like baker's chocolate you buy for goods. This is 100% chocolate, no sugar in it. Not super fun to eat on your own by itself unless you're really into that. Dark chocolates has some sugar. Milk chocolate has sugar and milk powder. These typically run milk chocolates anywhere from like 35 to low 40s. I've seen some like 50% milk chocolates that are really good, but you don't see those a whole often. White chocolate is just cocoa butter, milk powder, sugar, and vanilla. And there's ruby chocolate, which is a fairly new kind of chocolate. Has anyone seen this? It's popping up in some candy bars. But I mean, it's a pink chocolate that is made without the addition of flavorings. They alter the fermentation to give this very fruity, floral pink chocolate. So those are kind of the main types of actual chocolate that we deal with. Cocoa powder. They take that cocoa mass, they dry it, they process it, and it's ground and cooled. So typically like your base cocoa powder is kind of this tan, unsweetened cocoa powder. To change the color, they treat it with an alkali or a base. And the more alkalinity you apply to this product, the darker it gets. So when you see like Dutch processed cocoa powder, this process is called Dutching. So as you Dutch it, you add more alkalinity to it. That gives you a bolder color, a little bit more intense flavor. And if you really Dutch the crap out of it, you end up with black cocoa powder down here. And this is typically what we associate with Oreos, right? Oreo cookies are made with this black cocoa powder. If you've had an Oreo, you know, like the flavor of that cookie is very different from like anything you make with like standard cocoa powder on its own. So it changes the flavor and gives it a very distinct flavor. If you're baking with black cocoa powder, since it has so much alkalinity to it, it can sometimes throw the chemistry off in your recipes. It'll make cakes and muffins kind of go haywire and sometimes kind of bubble up. So if you want to use this, it's actually kind of nice to use because usually like I'll set out like maybe a third of my regular cocoa powder for black cocoa powder. You still get the color, you still get the flavor without kind of altering your chemistry, and you don't have to use a lot of this expensive ingredient. But it's kind of nice, can give some of your baked goods a nice flavor, things like that. On other considerations with chocolate, obviously like for me, when I'm buying chocolate, like taste is important. Depending on what I'm doing, I might consider like the varietal, you know, which bean it's coming from, who's making it. But I'll often have different chocolates for different uses. Like the chocolate that I use to melt down into brownies is not the same chocolate that I'm going to use to make fine, you know, bonbons or things where I want the chocolate to shine through. If I'm going to dump a bunch of like sugar and vanilla and eggs and flour into it, I'm going to lose a lot of the characteristics of some of those more delicate chocolates. So I'll probably save those more expensive higher end chocolates for a way that I can really kind of showcase the flavor on its own. So that's why I say expensive is not always the best, depending on what I'm doing. Sometimes it's better go for a cheaper, less complex thing if I'm using it that way, like chocolate chip cookies. I'm not going to buy like super expensive chocolate chunks and put them in a cookie. Even though it'd be delicious, it's not really kind of cost effective. You have to store chocolate cool and dry, otherwise it blooms. Anyone seen pad chocolate where it kind of gets this kind of like powdery film on it? Like kind of like this, you'll see these powdery film, or you'll see like little white crystallization on it. That happens either when it comes in contact with water. So this kind of bloom, this sugar bloom happens when exposed to humidity or water during the processing process. And then this kind of fat bloom happens when it's held in the incorrect temperature. And when your chocolate blooms, it doesn't mean that it's bad. You can still eat it, it's still safe, it's not bad. It's just the crystalline structure is kind of thrown out of whack. It's perfectly good to use for baking and eating. It just affects the texture a little bit. But kind of the way we prevent bloom, and we get that shiny texture, is we temper it. And if anyone's watched like the Great British Bake Off, you know, people like whenever they have to temper chocolate, they start freaking out and panicking. It's very difficult. It is kind of stressful because chocolate is very, very finicky. But essentially when we temper chocolate, we're trying to align the polymorphic crystals in the cocoa butter. And there's several, I believe there's like 6 different cocoa butter crystals that exist in cocoa butter. There's like gamma crystals, alpha, beta, beta prime. And the beta crystals are the most stable. And what we're trying to do through the process of tempering is to melt all of the other crystals. And we want to get the beta crystals, which are the most stable ones, to be solidified. So we can either do, there's different ways we can do that, which I'll talk about in a minute. But kind of the difference between tempered and untempered chocolate. Tempered chocolate is very shiny. It's reflective. It has a good snap. It has a good mouthfeel, like it melts really well in your mouth and increases the shelf life. If you fail to temper chocolate or don't temper it properly, it can get soft and bendy. It can get kind of granular in your mouth. It won't set. So if you're making chocolates or you're doing any kind of chocolate work, like dipping chocolate covered strawberries, that chocolate is going to melt like as soon as your finger touches it. But properly tempered chocolate can stand up to a little bit more heat. So kind of right here, like tempered chocolate has this nice shiny look. Untempered chocolate will get bloom. It will be soft, spongy, bendy. But the way we do that typically, I don't know if I have it on there. So you can either do it by temperature control, where we heat it up to a certain temperature, we lower it down to a certain temperature, and then we very gently bring it up to a very specific temperature based on if we're doing milk white or dark. And that allows us to melt all the other crystals and then just set those beta crystals because they're the most stable. You can also do it by adding a little bit of pre-tempered chocolate into it. That process is known as seeding. But that's a little bit more than I want to get into with you, because I try and teach my students that spend 5 weeks trying to teach my students how to do it, and they're still hating their lives by the end of 5 weeks tempering chocolate with me in class. But one thing to know about chocolate is a dry substance. Like even though it's liquid and it's like got fat in it, there's no moisture in it. So moisture is like the mortal enemy of chocolate. It causes it to seize up, it causes it to break. So you have to do it gently. You have to do it without contact of water. So typically the best way to melt chocolate is in a microwave over a double boiler. You can't do it over direct heat or else it'll burn. So very delicate process. But once it's tempered, it allows you to make sculptures out of it, garnishes. If you like chocolate bars, you want to have tempered properly so they have a nice snap. And they're used for like making bonbons and things like this. Those brightly colored tempered cocoa butter shell and then chocolate on the inside. But those are uses for tempered chocolate. It takes a while to kind of get down, and whenever I'm tempering chocolate, making these things, I'm usually very grumpy for 2 days until I know that they're going to come out of the mold and they're successful, and I'm a much more pleasant person once they come out and they look very nice. But getting to that point is sometimes rough. But yeah, so any questions about that? And then I'm kind of gonna want to demonstrate a little bit of how we bring chocolate down. I know I kind of went fast and furious. I want to make sure we got time for this, but any questions on how chocolate is processed or the forms of chocolate that it takes? Okay. This is our Costa Rica trip here. If you're interested in the QR code, feel free to go to that. But up here, what I have, so this is a melange. It's 2 steel rollers that are set in to rotate. And essentially, if you're doing chocolate like on your own, and some like local chocolate makers will do this, they don't necessarily have the equipment to take the paste and then like press it out and then reblend it. So typically I'm kind of doing my math, my calculations initially, like how much cocoa butter I need to add to it, how much sugar I need to it. And then I'm just kind of grinding it down on its own. So the main 3 ingredients you have, I got nibs. So these are like the crushed up dry things. Cocoa butter, typically I would have this melted before it goes in, but I don't have an oven in here. And then sugar. But I'm going to put this down. If you turn this on, it kind of rolls. It'll get a little less noisy in a minute. I usually use a heat gun because heat will extract the fat out of the cocoa nibs. So once I get it in there, If you want to come up and see this, feel free, because I mean, I know you can't see it, but you can come up, you can see it. You'll start to smell the chocolate eventually. But as I put it in here real quick. And it is kind of a slow process, like it'll probably take me a good 15 minutes or so to get the chocolate and the sugar in there. But then I've got to let this run for at least 24 hours. And this is kind of simulating that punching process where I'm gonna have a little piece of this slowly pull out. Not that hot.